This is the Mobile Home Park Lawyer Podcast with Ferd Niemann. If you're looking to generate wealth and passive income in the lucrative world of mobile home parks, you're in the right place. You'll discover solutions to the common legal and operational pitfalls and how to optimize parks to maximize income. Your host is in the trenches. He's a real estate attorney, financial analyst, and mobile home park investor and operator. Now, let's turn it over to Ferd Niemann.
Welcome back, Mobile Home Park Nation. Ferd Niemann here again today with another episode of the Mobile Home Park Lawyer Podcast. Got another great guest for you today. He works within the state of Iowa. He's a lobbyist. He's very knowledgeable on all things politics and legislative agendas. So please help me welcome my guest, Andy Conlin. Andy, thanks for coming on, man.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, well, I've got to meet you and get to know you a little bit. We got some parks in Iowa as well, and appreciate you keeping your eyes and ears out for the park owners there. Maybe tell us a little bit about your background, how you got into the MH business.
Yeah, happy to. So I am the executive director of the Iowa Manufactured Housing Association. I am also a multi-client lobbyist. I've got clientele in almost every industry that you can think of. I actually have been in government relations now for over 20 years. Like all swamp monsters, I started out in DC, working my way up the ranks in Washington. In 2015, I came out to Iowa. I met my wife and moved to Iowa. And I've been kind of a fixture at the Iowa Capitol ever since. I worked on the legislative staff up there. When I got to Iowa, I was ultimately chief of staff to the president of the state senate. And then in 2020, I started my lobbying operation. And the Iowa Manufactured Housing Association was one of my early clients. I serve as our executive director. So I not only represent the industry at the Capitol, but I also run our association functions here in Iowa. And it's an honor to represent this industry.
Yeah, no, that's great. I appreciate it. It's quite the change, I'm sure, going from DC to Iowa.
You know what's funny? Everybody always says that,
Yeah.
and I am an Iowa truther. You're out in DC, everything's hard. It's hard to park. It's hard to go to the grocery store. It's hard to get around. Iowa and especially Des Moines has everything you want in a big city, but it's to scale. It's great.
Right. No, that's great. I get up to Iowa. I was there a couple weeks ago. I always enjoy it. This last summer I went to the Field of Dreams. I'd never been that far
Oh, cool.
northeast, and that part of Iowa was just beautiful, and really enjoyed it. But
Well, I'll try not to be offended that you didn't give me a shout when you were in town, but sure, happy to have you in Iowa.
All right, yeah. Well, I usually don't stop much. It's one park to one park to the next. I don't spend much money for your economy, unfortunately. I just stop for gas, and that's about it. I don't stick around I don't stay overnight very often. But let's talk politics here and kind of issues coming down the pike. So some of them are undoubtedly Iowa specific, but some of them are not. I mean, the big ones that come to mind are regulatory, rent control issues, and I see in lots of states there's now issues where you have to give your tenants a right of first refusal. Other problems, as I say problems, because often for the park owners, just more grief, more red tape. And some stuff's not a big deal. Like you've got to make sure they have smoke detectors. Okay, you should do that anyway, right? Okay, you've got to give them weather radios in some states. Okay, now you got to find a weather radio. The bigger issues for me often are the installation guidelines. Some states require robust concrete, either piers or pad. For most everybody does for new homes. Actually, Kansas does not. But used homes, some states require that level of concrete, some do not. So that's a cost issue. So I'm just curious, what are you typically working on for your MH client and for the association, and what should we be looking out for as a park owner?
Yeah, let me zoom out. I think one of the really interesting things about manufactured housing right now is I think more so than probably any other rental setting in America, it seems like a lot of the folks who were really interested in, the cancel rent crowd, a lot of folks kind of that ilk have focused their attention on manufactured housing. So I think one of the things that I've seen is a very well organized, very well financed effort to try and bring things like rent control, like right of first refusal to residents, to manufactured housing. I think there's a couple of reasons for that. I think one, we are in a lot of ways an industry in transition. And I think ultimately this is going to be a very positive transition for the industry, but I think we have a lot of communities that have been owned by families or mom and pop operators for an awful long time who are finding that the next generation doesn't want to continue to do this work, and they're selling out to investment groups. Some of those investment groups are small, some of them are really large, but you're seeing a professionalization of the industry. And I think one of the things that comes along with that is you're seeing industry ownership groups who are moving from treating their community as a little bit like a clubhouse. And that's not to say that all individual family ownership groups operate that way, but certainly we know that there are some out there who do. Those communities are being transitioned to ownership groups who treat these things more like a business. And I think that for a lot of residents, that's a pretty significant change. And I think that the folks who are out there pushing the rent control agenda have started to seize upon that and really push hard, especially at the state level, to enact changes that are favorable to their position. And I say well-funded, not to sound conspiratorial, but I think you have seen major efforts by large foundations and organized labor and different groups in that ecosystem push pretty serious money into this space. So, I don't like to sound like a conspiracy theorist. I don't like to say there's a boogeyman behind the curtain, but there is certainly a well-organized, well-funded, well-capitalized effort that's operating on a multi-state basis to push this agenda. So I think for those of us who are operating in red states, it's been a pretty difficult boulder to push. I think in red states in particular, you come in and you talk about things like rent control, and I think a lot of these state legislators in particular have been conditioned to say, hey, maybe this isn't a great idea. But I think we have seen a significant number of blue states, thinking about Delaware, Maine, California, start to push some really onerous regulations out there on community owners. I think we've seen a really significant right of first refusal push. There are a number of states that are seeing these bills that say as a condition of sale or prior to sale that the ownership group must give some type of notice to tenants and tenant groups to give them the opportunity to buy the community. And obviously, from a business transaction perspective, that's certainly problematic. But I think if you're a legislator, especially a citizen legislator like we have in most of these state capitals, it seems pretty reasonable, right? They don't necessarily internalize the impact that this will have on a business transaction. And if I could just briefly, I want to define my terms a little bit. A couple of things. I think one, the big message that I want to give to community owners or folks who are looking to get into communities around the country is a vast majority of the rules and regulations that you're going to have to operate under are set in your state capitals. They're not necessarily set in Washington, D.C. They're set in places like Topeka and Sacramento and Des Moines and Lansing. So as a community owner, when you think about where you need to get involved and where you need to make sure your voice is heard, it's those state capitals that are really, really critical. And I used a term when I was talking about right of first refusal that I want to make sure I double click on, and it is to say it is citizen legislator. Most of the legislators out there at the state level are citizen legislators. They're part-time legislators. They come to the Capitol for a short period of time. In Iowa, for example, it's 100 or 110 days, depending on the year. But in the vast majorities of states, it's somewhere between 60 and 150. They come to the state Capitol. They leave their jobs. Most of these folks have day jobs, and they operate as state legislators. So if you're a legislator in Lansing, Michigan, for example, now that's a bad example because they're a full-time legislator, but let me take Indiana, for example. Most of those folks have day jobs. They're farmers, they're bankers, they're teachers, they do something else on the side. So they're not necessarily experts in housing policy or manufactured housing or a variety of other issues that impact the day-to-day life of the people of that state. So it's really important for community owners to make sure that they know who their legislator is, that they talk to them, that they bring them to their community, if it makes sense. And they help those folks understand, hey, these policies may sound great to someone who isn't necessarily involved in the industry, but let me talk to you about the real impact that these policies have.
Yeah, no, I mean, guys, you're right. I mean, all politics is local, as they say, and
Yes, sir.
at the local level. But yeah, it does make sense. I think that, oh, well, if it's just a right of first refusal. Like, yeah, if I'm going to sell this park for $1 million, I don't care if my tenants. In fact, I would love for my tenants to buy it. The problem is it's a low probability that they're actually going to execute on it and do it. But now I've told them it's for sale. So like, oh, well, this is for sale. He's probably not going to evict me right now because he's going to have lower occupancy. I'm going to stop paying rent. Or wait, now might be a time. Anytime I see a guy on site, I'm going to make every complaint known to man to blow up his sale. Or I kind of like Ferd. I don't want it to be some big corporate guy buying next. I heard it happened in the next town. The corporate guy raised the rent. Let's blow up this sale the best way we can. And then it's like, oh man, this is, a big problem. And I mean, I think some of these problems, I get it. I mean, rent control, I think, is probably I think it's the only policy that economists on both sides of the aisles have said is a bad idea. And it's failed everywhere for centuries now, but it
Yep.
keeps getting pushed and it keeps getting approved. Um, and I think for MH, part of the challenge is we had some bad actors. I call them bad actors, but some examples that they, the little Johnny brings to the legislature says that big company out of that big state bought this property, all these properties, and they raised the rent 50%. That's a huge number. Sometimes 50% is $200 to $300, but it's only $100. But it's not only $100 when 200 is what you are used to. If you're, a lot of people don't have another 100 laying around overnight. So, but aside from, gouging the rent, what are some things that, so don't gouge the rent, do things right. What are some things that we as park owners can do to, just to get in front of this so that it's not an issue? I mean, there's like, for example, I'm not aware of any law that says park owners are no longer allowed to keep people from having F-150s in their park because no park owner has had a rule saying no F-150s. So that's not become an abusive issue. So it's not a legislative arrow we need to dodge. So what can we do?
I think there are a couple things. I think, first of all, I want to make a quick comment on why, despite the fact that rent control has failed everywhere it's been tried, we keep hearing about it. And I think this is important for people to understand that oftentimes in advocacy, people reach for the easy button. If you are a legislator and you think that rents are going up too much in your community, the reality is it's because of a variety of macroeconomic reasons and microeconomic reasons and individual market characteristics. But that easy button to fix that problem that you're hearing about is rent control. And I think that's something that I think a lot of advocates around the country have to make sure that individual legislators understand. If you think that rent is too high in your community, and I'm broadening out beyond just manufactured housing, you've got a supply and demand problem. You don't have a problem that you can just hit an easy button and say, we've solved it, mission accomplished.
Right.
And solving the supply and demand problem is much more difficult than enacting some kind of statutory limit on what owners can do in terms of their rent. So that's the first thing I would say. I think the second thing I would say, regardless of where you are in America, it's really important that you're paying attention to your MHA, your Manufactured Housing Association, and the issues that your legislature is confronting. I'll give you a great example. And there's never going to be a news story written about this. It's never going to be on Twitter. But we have a problem in Iowa with a handful of district courts throwing out eviction actions because of essentially, in my opinion, courts making up notice requirements. Historically, the courts have said that you need to notice X, Y, and Z individuals. And now the courts are throwing out evictions saying, we actually want you to notice A, B, C, and X, Y, Z. So we're going to take your non-payment eviction and we're going to force you to start back at square one. Those types of issues happen in every state in America. And the severity is going to vary state to state based on local circumstances. But that's why it's so critically important that you're talking to your manufactured housing association, because you're not going to get information about bills related to issues like that anywhere else. It's so specific to your industry. So I think that is something that I would spend an awful lot of time trying to make sure you're acquainted with in the states that you're operating in, because I think when we talk about state legislative issues for manufactured housing, the sexy issues get all the attention, right? Everybody wants to talk about rent control. And don't get me wrong, it's incredibly critical. But when you're owning and operating a community, oftentimes it's those nuts and bolts type issues, like who do I notice in an eviction? And am I going to have consistency for those notification requirements into the future that are really, really important to your day-to-day operations? So that manufactured housing association touch in your state is really.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, I mean, we've learned even evictions. I know in Iowa, our eviction attorney is out of Des Moines, but for a while, it depends on the city actually. And he was good and he's reasonably priced. So we said, "Can you go to these other towns in Iowa, Central Iowa, Eastern, but we don't want to pay you to drive. Can you do them remote?" And he's like, in this because he was doing them remote in Des Moines, and so one county, he's like, "Let me check." They said, "Yep, I can." They're Zoom calls, so he's now representing us 3 hours away. Next county, 2 hours away, he calls. He goes, "Nope, in person only," and I can't do it for the same price. Obviously, if I got to drive 2 hours each way, so then we got to find somebody else. Well, some of these towns, smaller towns particularly, they don't have a lot of eviction attorneys,
Yep.
or they're conflicted out because they do a little everything, so they also represent your tenant on their criminal matter. So then I've had that happen where the judge, I've had an attorney, she did 10 in a row, and then on 11th one she's like, "Oh, I can't help you against this guy because I'm his defense attorney." Good grief.
Well, you should know that, and this is the type of work we do here in Iowa, in addition to fighting the big picture stuff. One of the things that we have in an omnibus bill that we're trying to get done would require each court in the state to allow you to participate virtually.
That'd be
So,
great.
so we're gonna, knock on wood, we're gonna solve that problem for you.
No, that'd be great. Little stuff like that because it has big impact. What other issues are coming down the pike? Maybe in Iowa, but then just you think industry wide that
Yeah.
maybe good stuff that's coming down the pike, or any negative stuff coming down the pike.
I think in terms of good stuff, I always want to talk about the good stuff, right? I think the Manufactured Housing Institute, the National Trade Association for the industry, is working really hard on some things that hopefully are going to lower the cost for manufactured housing, manufactured homes. They're looking at particularly clipping some of the energy standard requirements that we saw out of the Biden administration. That would be, if those energy standards were actually enacted, industry experts project that homes would cost 15 to 20% more new, which is insane.
Right.
So I think that is a positive. I think they're making real progress on that front. I also know that there are a lot of groups that are working with national financial entities to try and open up more lending in this space, because we all know that chattel lending is an issue. Folks are certainly looking for more financing opportunities to purchase manufactured homes. So I think those are the good things. I think other good things that are happening, frankly, and this is no consolation to our friends in some of the blue states, but I do think there is a little bit of buyer's remorse on some of the more draconian laws that we've seen passed. And you're starting to see it in some of your more responsible actors in some of these blue states. Like, for example, the governor of Massachusetts about 2 weeks ago came out against a statewide ballot initiative on rent control. You saw Jared Polis, the governor of Colorado, push back on some statewide rent control issues. So I do think on some level there's a recognition that maybe some of these policies aren't really what we're looking for here. I think in terms of potential concerns coming down the road, certainly we are continuing to see well-organized and aggressive efforts in many, many states to organize residents and get them to talk to policymakers about perceived issues in MHCs. I think, I realize this is the second or third time I've said this during this conversation. I don't want to sound like I'm coming from conspiracy corner here, but we certainly don't have a friend in the media. I think we're finding that the media loves to write the big time wealthy MHC owner operator, probably from out of state, who isn't taking care of their community, and therefore you have low and middle income residents who are living in a bad situation. That story is not going away.
Right.
It just isn't. And I think that's an easy story for the media to write. And I think that combined with organizing on the resident side is going to continue to be a challenge for us at the state level all around the country. Um, we spend an awful lot of time here in Iowa making sure legislators are educated on what is happening with these stories, who the players are, what's really happening on the ground. We spend an awful lot of time on our political advocacy work, frankly, in terms of PAC fundraising. We do an awful lot to be a significant player in the Iowa political ecosystem. And we do that, frankly, because it's the right thing to do, but also because we have a well-organized, well-funded group of folks who would really like to see some changes that are really bad for the rental environment.
Yeah, so like, if I want to get involved myself, or I want to move the needle, is there any purpose in me trying to contact my own rep or legislator, or is it better just to go through your organization, or in particular, if I want to talk to a government agency? So like, if I call the DNR and complain that their requirements on X and Y are too onerous, they're going to be like, that's the rule, it's not going to work. I mean, are you able to impact any agencies? Because that's where I feel like it's a headache, like red tape. I've got a park in Kansas right now, and I told them I'm going to improve the place. I'm going to put in the playground, a dog park, all this kind of stuff. And they go, hold on, you're putting in a playground? What kind of playground? I go, just like a playground.
Playground.
In a commercial, good sized playground, not just like one you have in your backyard. And they're like, oh, well, you need to make it an accessible playground, which has, wider, for people in wheelchairs, wider,
Right.
which, I'm not anti-kid in wheelchair, but to put that playground in, I'm like, I'm buying these playgrounds used from schools that are closing. So I buy a used playground. We buy it for $5K. It's a $50,000 playground. We take it out, move it here, repaint it, looks like new, put it there. We're all in for like $10,000. The accessible playground is like $250,000. And I was like, I can't do a successful playground in this park. And they go, well, you have to. Okay, well then there goes our playground. That wasn't the budget. We're gonna put a dog park in. What's that? It's basically a fence with a gate, and there's little hoops and jumps in there.
Yeah.
It's not a big construction project.
Right.
We're gonna need permits for that, and it also has to be accessible. So we need you to put, and of course, I put it in the part of the park that is low, that's got a little floodplain, and all, so it's off the beaten path a little bit because it's like it's not a site, it's not a mobile home pad site. But now I got to put a concrete sidewalk 100 yards to get to it.
Yeah.
And it's like, little things like that. So is there anything we can do to, none of that stuff, and I get there's a purpose for permits, and I worked for the government for 5 years. Like I get that there's,
I'm sorry to hear that.
yeah, stuff to, if necessary, but it's like, they just continue to make the business harder.
Yeah.
One little thing after one little thing after one little thing. Anything we can do, or is that just, the way that it is, tough?
Yeah. So a couple things. I think one, the most important thing you can do is interact and talk to your manufactured housing association. There is one of me in every state, and that should certainly be your first touch. I will tell you, I can only speak for our experience in Iowa, but almost on a weekly basis, I have a member who reaches out who has some issue with the government entity. Oftentimes, I know someone in that government agency or that legislator, and oftentimes we can get it worked out. And if we can't work it out, we come up with solutions to get it worked out. I'll give you a great example. I've got a member who tried to sell a home to the state, manufactured home to the state, and the state procurement officers are alleging that in order to do the actual siting of the home, it qualifies as a public improvement and therefore subject to the state procurement laws for construction aside from the purchase of the home, which is silly. And in this case, we couldn't get the government officials where we needed them to be. And frankly, I think we're going to try and change the law to fix that. So I'm a big believer here that, look, there are federal requirements out there, and there's not a heck of a lot we can do about that. But if we can't work with agencies to get where we need to be, then the reason the legislature comes back every year is to change the law. So let's change the law. So I think that's for everybody out there. My advice would be the first touch is your manufactured housing association. If you're a member of the association, you are paying a lobbyist. And that lobbyist is going to be able to help you in some cases. I would also suggest to everyone that you get to know your local legislators at least. I find that most MHC owner operators have a great story to tell. We are providing a great source of unsubsidized, affordable housing for a key segment of the population. These are folks who get up early and go home late and work hard and are living the American dream. So in most places, we've got a really good story to tell, and we need to tell people that story. So I think that is critically important. And finally, I would just suggest to everyone out there, make sure you're up to date either through your association or through some other source on what the legislatures consider. Because those state laws, again, aren't going to get the attention of the local news in most cases, but they're setting the rules of the road for how you operate. And it's really important that you know those rules, that you comply with those rules. And as the rules are changing, you take that opportunity to influence them and say, hey, I'm going to show up at this committee meeting through my association or myself and say, we love what your intent is here. We think everybody wants to help people, but it doesn't work, and here's why. Or it does work, and you have to do this. I think that's critically important, and I encourage everybody to make sure you're involved in what's happening in your state capitol.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let me ask you about resident relations. I mean, everybody who's a landlord has residents that, appreciate them and that you love them back. But everybody's got residents that hate you no matter what you do. And it's just a matter of time until they, accuse you of stealing from them or yelling at their kids, or I've been accused of stealing their money, like, just like you stole from me. Like, what are you talking about? I had a bicycle and I know your manager took it because they didn't like my kids. Like, really? You think, I mean, there's crazy stuff all the time, it seems like. Is there any advice you have based on your interactions with all your customers? Like, what can we do to kind of make the residents happier or make them at least rational and reasonable where they don't make up stuff like, we didn't steal your bicycle. Some of them have cameras on their house. Like, why don't you look at your camera, see who stole your bicycle? If you see my manager, I will personally fire them. I'm sure he wasn't me. But, if it was my manager, we will fire them. I promise. We had a guy person say that he had a pistol that he was hiding underneath his trailer, taped up into the underbelly, and that my manager must have found it when fixing some skirting and stole his gun and sold it for money. He got the tenant next door to testify that she witnessed this. And they brought it. And I said, okay, we're going to go to court. I'm going to personally go with you and file charges on my manager. And you're going to go under oath here. We're going to prosecute it. I'm going to take care of it. And I'm going to fire him if proven guilty. But he deserves to have his day in court. And then finally one of them was like, okay, I didn't see it. But I mean, why would we break it? Why was there a gun underneath the trailer? So what can we do on those sort of situations? Anything?
Right. So a couple of thoughts. I mean, I think first of all, I think as an ownership group, you got to be a little bit eyes wide open about it, right? The reality is we're serving the public, and not everyone in the public is a sane and rational actor. So I know that is not the magic bullet, but that is part of the understanding when you're going into a business where you're serving the public. So that's the first thing. I think from a management perspective, there are a couple of things that I always encourage folks to do. One, make sure you're communicating frequently, over communicating, and being factual about what you're communicating. I think one of the places where we typically see friction, for example, is when it comes to rent increases. Look, no one likes to hear that their rent is going up. I don't care who you are. I don't care how much money you make. Nobody wants to hear that they're paying.
Right.
Fair. But I really encourage my members here in Iowa to have a plan, be really open and transparent, over communicate, have an open door policy. You're going to have people who are going to come in and they're going to want to complain. It's the nature of business when you're serving the public. Be open to that. Hear people out. I think that over communication is really, really important. Setting people's expectations is really, really important. I have members who, and I think this makes an awful lot of sense, adjust their rent every year. And, you see it in apartments. It makes
Right.
all the sense to do it in manufactured housing. Folks should know what to expect year over year.
Right,
So,
we do it every year. We do modest
yep,
rent increases, but we call even on day one when we buy a new park, we say this is your annual rent increase. Like we tell them it's going to happen, and we'll say we may spend
yep,
$200,000 in the first 30 days. Like we can't recoup that for a decade or decades perhaps. But what we say is, look, we're going to raise we're not going to raise your rent $100. We're going to raise your rent $30, but this is your annual rent increase. And then next year
right,
it's another $30. They got a pretty good idea what year three is going to be. It's not going to be
right,
15. It's unlikely to be 100.
right.
We kind of stare, or sometimes we'll do a little higher the first year just and because we put so much cap, but then it'll go down the next year, which is a percentage is even lower. But then they kind of get some comfort, like okay, rent goes every year, but it's at least not going up and then up by bigger chunks. But yeah, I totally agree that the
Well, and
community.
I think that's a really important point. And this is a message that I send to a lot of folks who contact me to say, hey, I'm thinking about buying a community in Iowa. And I think one of the places where the industry has gotten into trouble over the last couple of years is when you haven't have groups who come in, purchase a community, they do a large capital investment on the front end. We're doing new roads, doing new sewers, doing new lagoon, doing new whatever. And they try to recoup those funds too fast.
Right.
I think that's a little bit of the difference, and this would be a third piece of advice I give people, give new ownership groups, is you have to treat people like people. Uh, I think the people who get into trouble in the industry are the folks who are managing only by spreadsheet. And I think when folks in the legislature and the press talk about these astronomical rent increases, oftentimes it's someone who tries to recoup some kind of capital investment too fast. And that's when you're going to start to have policymakers, raise up and say, hey, there's an issue here. And look, I'm always a big advocate when it comes to this kind of thing to do the investments. Make sure they're visible, make sure people understand what you're doing, make sure you communicate to people, hey, we're, doing your wiring, we're doing your park, we're doing your sidewalks. But there's got to be some recognition there that going from 350 to 500 with 90 days notice is really untenable. It's
Right.
going to get policymakers engaged, and frankly, it's just not a good way to treat people. From if I'm being honest with you, and
Yeah.
the defense that we typically get from, or the retort, I guess, not defense, that we get from legislator or we get from ownership groups is, well, we've got to bring rent to market rates. And even in that situation, even if you purchase a community with rent well below market rates, whether you do or you do not do capital investment, when you're talking to policymakers and you say, well, yeah, the rent went from $200 a month a lot to 380, and yes, it's still below market rent. Legislators, in my experience, don't view that as an acceptable defense, because the
Agreed.
reality is for that resident, they saw their rent almost double.
Right.
And so, you know, the biggest piece of advice I have for owner operators out there is just make sure you're using a little bit of common sense when it comes to adjusting rent. Because when you don't is when you're going to start to have problems with policymakers. And I don't care if you're a red state, a blue state, a purple state. That is when that is going to start to bubble up.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. I mean, I've never heard this next comment. I never really hear anybody talk about, so maybe it's a dumb idea, but I had a park in Illinois and a park that was inferior to ours was already $200 more than our park because they had already raised it. They raised the rent $200. So it went to $400 more, and it wasn't market. It was they were just crazy above market, and they've subsequently lost that property to bankruptcy, foreclosure, because everyone left. Like it was a bad business move. But
Sounds like things are going great over there.
yeah, but as a result, the legislators started using them as a bad example. Look how much these guys jacked up rent. So then they said, we're going to impose rent control, 2% increases. And I'm sitting here like, my rent's 300. This guy went from 300 to 500 to 700. If you start doing 2%, I will never catch him.
Yeah.
And he's going to have locked in higher rents, and like he's going to like almost get rewarded because he did this. He's the one that the legislation was set for. He's gonna almost get rewarded. So I'm thinking, if you here's I said this in front of the PAC for Illinois. I said, here's rent control that I will support. I think you guys can even lead this. Try to modify it. I said, anyone who has raised rent more than 25% in a given year in the last 3 years, those people and that property shall be stuck at rent control of 2%. Anyone else can have rent control up to 20% or up to 10%, where that number is, so that the, I say good actors, the reasonable increases can just be like locked in forever, as opposed to this guy jumped 50% and then he jumped another 25 or 50, and then they're going to stick the rest of us. Like I had a park that I'm underwriting 10% rent increases 5 years in a row, which 10% sounds high, but it's like, it's not really that high, when it's $20 and $25 and $29, so on. But if you lock me at 2%, I've made a 5-year decision on this property. I'm never going to be able to get there. And if I've already spent all the capex, I can't even like be cheap going forward. I've already spent the money. So it's like I've done my portion of the deal. Like let me finish it out. Do you think there's any way to is that a decent, plan B that they say it's only going to be for properties that have already experienced rent increases? Because for me in that example, going up 25, 10%, that wasn't really going to be that brutal. It was pretty reasonable. You think this got any legs, or people are not going to? That's too detailed. I'm like, no. We don't want you to be the next guy, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, I think, to be honest with you, I'll give you a couple things. I think one, from an Iowa Manufactured Housing Association perspective, if a legislator came to me with that idea, this association and the people who who I represent have taken a hard line that any kind of rent control is going to make it difficult to improve communities. It's going to make it difficult to transact. It's going to make Iowa unattractive for investment. So this association here takes a pretty hard line on anything rent control, frankly, for any type of rental housing situation in the state.
Yeah, all or none kind of thing.
If the legislature came forward with rent control for apartments, we would vehemently oppose it. Right. On behalf of other landlords.
I mean, I would too. I was just thinking, man.
Yeah, I think when it comes to an idea like that, I think the enforcement of it is going to be complicated. So I think you'd have to be really thoughtful there. But ultimately, that's going to be a political decision based on the dynamics that are happening in your state. But I do want to double click on something you did say. I think when I look across where the industry is going, there's a very specific group of folks that I think need to be really conscious about the conversation that we're having right now. I think a lot of the large multi-state operators have figured it out. They've got their arms around and this isn't universally true, but in my experience in Iowa, a lot of our large multi-state operators who have a presence in Iowa have a playbook for what it looks like when they purchase a community, the amount of capex that needs to go in, how we can manage rent in a way to make it all work and be viable moving forward. I don't get a lot of news coverage about some of the big headline names that you think of as the big operators around America who are coming in here and jacking up rents in a way that's unsustainable. And we certainly don't see it with our individual family operators all that much. The group that I'm a little bit concerned about is the investment groups with a relatively small portfolio. Maybe it's their first MHC, maybe it's their third or fourth MHC. They're operating in a couple of different states. They get into a community and they make a capex, and from an investment and from a cash flow perspective, they need to adjust rent more than what I think our legislature would think makes sense in order to make it all pencil out. And what I really, really caution people on when they come into Iowa, if they haven't really gone through the paces in a lot of different states, is okay, I recognize that many of these communities that you're going to buy do need some CapEx up front, but you've got to make sure that your investments that you're going to make in the community pencil with reasonable rent increases for the next 3 to 5 years. Like, we can get you to market rent, but we can't get you to market rent in year one. And we can get you to a place where those capital investments make sense, but we're not going to do it in year one, because that's when we start to have industry-wide problems. So I just encourage folks out there who are in that position, and they're a great part of the industry, and I love it when they come to Iowa. We were talking before we started, my goal is to make Iowa the best state in America to own and operate an MHC. And so if you're out there and you're looking at Iowa, make sure you reach out to me, because we are going to make this the best state to do business in America. But if you're also in that position, make sure you're conscious of and recognize that making all of the changes from a fiscal perspective that you need to make in year one can put you in a pretty easy for me to say, pretty precarious position if you don't assume that there's going to be some runway that you're going to have to do in order to get to where you need to go from a rent perspective.
Yeah, no, I think that's good advice. Definitely seen the full gamut of people do it right and people do it wrong, and yeah, for sure. Well, Andy, this is good stuff. Before we jump, any other quick ideas or comments or tips you want to share?
Yeah, I would say the big thing is, to reiterate the message, make sure you're talking to your MHC, make sure you're talking to your legislators. And I am happy to be a resource to folks out there, especially if you're interested in doing business in Iowa. I am the biggest Iowa evangelist you can imagine. I am here to sing the praises of the great state of Iowa. So you can always find me at iamha.org. That's the Iowa Manufactured Housing Association. If you're already doing business in Iowa and you're not a member of the association, shame on you, because I believe that we're the best, most active association in America, and we'll make it worth your while. And you can always reach me directly. My email is very, very easy, Andy@iamha.org. Always happy to talk to folks who are interested in the industry and interested in Iowa, and we'll keep fighting the good fight here.
All right. Sounds good, Andy. Good stuff. Appreciate your time.
Happy to join you.
You've been listening to the Mobile Home Park Lawyer Podcast with Ferd Niemann. Ready to learn more? Go to www.themobilehomelawyer.com for free resources and materials to help you succeed. If you love the podcast, go to Apple Podcasts, give us your review, and subscribe today. Thank you for listening. Neither the Supreme Court of Missouri nor the Missouri Bar reviews nor approves certifying organizations or specialist designations. The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely upon advertisements.